This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into episode 11 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. I'm recording on Tuesday evening, September 12th, and with week one officially in the book, I think most of us had a miserable first week, including myself, but it is only 1 week and there's still plenty of time to right the ship. So for today's episode, I'm going to go through every team, yes, all 32 teams, and I'm going to highlight at least one stat or player that stood out to me. In many of these instances, these are related to players I was closely monitoring because I knew they had the potential for wide-ranging outcomes. Some of my projections I feel really good about, and others I admit I got wrong and I need to quickly adjust. So moving forward, I may not hit on all 32 teams every week on this pod, but for today's episode, I wanted to cover all 32 teams given that we just finished week one. So let's dive into 32 observations from week one of the NFL season. So let's start with the Thursday night game and the Super Bowl defending champions, Kansas City Chiefs. Now without Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes, he spread the ball around. He had 12 different players that got targets Thursday night. However, it was an abysmal night for Kadarius Toney and Sky Moore, I think the two players that we were keeping an eye on the most. Unfortunately, even after week one, I think Sky Moore is borderline droppable already. I would hold Toney another week if I could. He only played 16 snaps. He ran 11 routes. He got 5 targets. Most of those were by design. The other player I'm eyeballing, Isaiah Pacheco, he played less than 50% of snaps, and he only had 12 opportunities. That's 8 carries plus 4 targets. Now, Pacheco was a player I highlighted as a fade in both redraft and dynasty over the summer, and I'd continue to try and move him off my rosters if I could. Other than Mahomes and Kelce, who I expect to play next week, there's no one else I would consider starting going forward. As for the Detroit Lions, I want to focus on David Montgomery. You see, Montgomery finished with 13.4 points, and he was inside the top 20 of running backs in week one. Now, historically, 13 points finishes much lower than where it did this week, but running back scoring was down in week one. But what I'm laser focused on is that he played 55 of 70 snaps. That's 77% snap participation, but he did not have a single target on 20 routes run. That's almost unheard of. You see, last year, no running back ran this many routes and didn't get a single target. The most was Travis Etienne, who had one game where he had 18 routes run and no targets. And Montgomery found the end zone, meaning almost half of his points in week one came from scoring a touchdown. Now I looked at every running back last year who had a game where they scored a touchdown. That's 316 instances. I divided their fantasy points by their number of snaps. That'd be points per snap played. And David Montgomery, he scored the lowest points per snap played than all 316 instances from last year. From a fantasy standpoint, that is a lot of squeeze for so little juice. And quite frankly, if you started Montgomery last week, I think you got lucky. And this week, I would not recommend you start him again. Dan Campbell has already said rookie Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get more snaps in the coming weeks as they ramp him up. And for context, many have said Montgomery took over the Jamal Williams role from last year, and Gibbs took over the DeAndre Swift role from last year. However, last year, Williams only had one game where he had over a 70% snap share. In fact, all but 2 games, Williams was below a 50% snap share. So Montgomery's snaps are coming down. This is a given. But if he doesn't start getting targets, he's going to be nothing more than a fringe running back 2 that you are depending on him to find the end zone to have value that week. Now, before I move on to Sunday's game, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review, as that'll help us grow. Lastly, you can engage with us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod, and you can email us directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. So let's move on to these Sunday games. Now let's start what I think is from my vantage point, the most depressing team from a fantasy standpoint. And that's the Atlanta Falcons, whose head coach, Arthur Smith, has said he does not care about your fantasy team. He literally said that yesterday. And he's right. He's paid to win games. So it's really up to us to adjust. And sadly, the outlook for Drake London and Kyle Pitts, two supremely talented players, their outlook is just very poor in fantasy this year. The Falcons ran 51 plays in week 1, the lowest by far in the league, and they had 18 freaking pass attempts. To put that in context, we all agreed the Bears couldn't or wouldn't try and throw the football last year, right? They had the lowest number of pass attempts in the league. They were averaging 23 pass attempts a game. That's still 5 more per game than the Falcons passed for on Sunday. And the Falcons still won. There's no immediate incentive to change course. Arthur Smith wants to run the football and play good defense. Drake London and Kyle Pitts, they each ran 20 routes, but they combined for 4 targets. These guys are too good to be dropped in redraft, but unfortunately right now you can't start either. Until the passing volume dramatically increases, these 2 guys have to stay on your bench. I will say this though, both guys are great rebuilding targets in Dynasty. If you can acquire them without giving up a 2024 first, I would still encourage it. Lastly, I'll recommend that you listen to my waiver wire episode as I'll explain why Tyler Algier is a priority waiver target this week. As for the Panthers, I think you can safely start Miles Sanders as a running back 2 for the rest of the season. He was on the field for almost 60% of snaps. He got twice as many carries and targets as Chuba Hubbard did. And Hubbard didn't even have an advantage in the red zone. I think the Panthers are likely to be behind on a lot of games this year, and week 1 showed that the Panthers trust Sanders enough to handle a majority of the passing downs. So again, you can safely put Miles Sanders in your starting lineup going forward. Now moving on to the Texans at the Ravens, the major concern that I had for the Texans, it has to be Dameon Pierce. He only played 48% of snaps. This is well below what his snap share was in the preseason when he was out there with the rest of the starters. And even worse, he only got 11 carries, which is well below his average carry count from last year. Excluding week 1, where he barely played as a rookie, he averaged 17 carries and 3 targets a game. Week 1, he had 11 carries and 3 targets. Now, I'm not willing to bench him yet, but I think the game script being down played a part, but CJ Stroud had 44 pass attempts in his rookie game. I don't think they want to consistently do that going forward, but it's concerning if Pierce did not get the same amount of opportunity as he consistently saw last year. Now, as for the Ravens, Zay Flowers already appears to be the wide receiver 1 for this team. By the way, he's still available in 20% of leagues ahead of the week 2 waiver wire. Now, Flowers led the team in targets with 10 targets, and he had a commanding 36% targets per route run. And he got 2 carries. Flowers finished inside the top 20 on the week, even though he didn't even find the end zone. Now, Baltimore will almost certainly increase their pass volume. They only had 22 attempts in week 1 as the season progresses, and Flowers will benefit from that. Now, obviously it needs to be said, Mark Andrews was absent in week 1 with an injury. If Andrews returns, I would still be okay sitting Flowers for 1 more week until we see how Flowers performs next to Mark Andrews. But he's still available in 20% of leagues, and he should be a high priority target if he is still somehow available in your league. Now, there was one game with a lot of fantasy implications going forward that I was keeping an eye on, and that was Jacksonville at Indianapolis. Now, first for the Jags, 2 important things. Now, all summer, I was fading Travis Etienne because I was worried about Tank Bigsby eating into his work. However, that did not materialize in week 1. Etienne was getting about 2/3 of the snaps after the Jags traded James Robinson before the deadline last year, but Etienne played 80% of the snaps in week 1. That's the highest snap share of his career. He ran 30 routes, he got 5 targets, and he caught all of them. And he broke a run for a touchdown. If Etienne continues to see a dominant snap share and route participation, he's going to be a top 10 running back on the year. Now, while Etienne is trending up, teammate Christian Kirk has to be trending down. Now, Kirk finished wide receiver 11 last year, but he was a distant 3rd in snaps, route runs, and targets in week 1 behind Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones. Kirk appears to have been replaced by Ridley, and he's been relegated to a slot role primarily. Kirk wasn't below 80% route participation in any game last year, Unfortunately, he was down to 67% in week 1. As for Indianapolis, I am so excited about Anthony Richardson. He did what we expected on the ground. He had 40 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown. But I did not see the passing volume or efficiency coming this early. Richardson had 37 passing attempts with a 65% completion rate, 223 yards, and another passing touchdown. He should be locked in as a top 10 quarterback in redraft for the rest of the year, and I think it's possible he could be a top 5 quarterback in dynasty startups next summer. Now, by the way, Richardson, he is still available in 20% of redraft leagues. So make sure you double check in your leagues right now. And because Richardson had the passing volume was much higher than we expected, Michael Pittman appears to be a great value for where he was drafted. Pittman caught 8 of 11 targets for nearly 100 yards and a touchdown. And as long as Richardson is passing at this volume and efficiency, Pittman should be an auto start in redraft going forward. Now, as for the Saints at the Titans, I'm looking at the running back position for both of these teams. Now, for the Saints, Jamal Williams had the usage we expected and desired, but unfortunately, it did not transfer into the production we anticipated. Williams only had 2.5 yards per carry, and he caught 2 short targets, no touchdowns. But he was still on the field for over 70% of the team's snaps, and he got almost all of the carries given to the running backs. Now, the Saints did work in Taysom Hill and Rashid Shaheed for carries too, but Williams' usage in a positive matchup next week with Carolina, I think, is enough for me to consider another start. Now, as for Tennessee, strangely, backup rookie running back Tyjae Spears played more snaps than Derrick Henry did in a very competitive game. Now, Henry had less than 50% snap share, and he only had 17 opportunities. He had 15 carries plus 2 targets. Henry has averaged over 25 opportunities a game for the last 2 years, and he's had less than 15 opportunities only twice in 24 games played since 2021. Now, another week of sub 50% snap share, and I'll be very worried about Derrick Henry for the rest of the season. So for 32 observations this week, I'm required to hit on every team, so let's just quickly talk Arizona at Washington because, quite frankly, I was unimpressed with both teams. For Arizona, James Conner is the only player that you can reasonably start going forward. His usage gives us a solid running back 2 floor every week. Conner played 83% of snaps, he ran 29 routes, he had 5 targets. I have to imagine Conner will be the primary option in the red zone, assuming the Cardinals can actually find it. But steer clear of the rest of this offense. Let's wait a few weeks and see if Kyler Murray actually returns. As for Washington, Brian Robinson has taken control of this backfield from Antonio Gibson. Regrettably, I have been in the Gibson camp all summer, but Gibson only had a 35% snap share to Robinson's 61%. Robinson dominated the red zone, and he had a receiving touchdown. But honestly, neither running back ran well, and combined, they only had 3 targets, which was 10% target share combined for the 2 of them. There wasn't a single week last year where the running back unit for Washington had this low a target share. In fact, half of their games, their running back group was upward of 20%, twice the percentage of what they saw in week 1. I don't think you can start either, and another performance by Gibson like week 1, and he's going to be droppable. As for San Francisco, boy, did they look the part of a Super Bowl contender, absolutely dominating, I think, what is actually a pretty solid Pittsburgh team on the road. But let me comment on Christian McCaffrey, because I think there was some concern the Niners were going to limit his usage early in the year just to keep him healthy, but that was not the case in week 1, even in a game that was a blowout. McCaffrey played 85% of snaps, he commanded 26 opportunities, and from week 8 on last year, after he was traded to San Francisco, McCaffrey averaged 21 opportunities a game. That was 5 fewer than he had in week 1. As long as CMC stays healthy, he's going to end up as the running back 1 on the season. Conversely, one running back who is not going to end up as an RB1 on the season is Steelers' Najee Harris. Now, I was concerned coming into the season that Jaylen Warren was the better back. I think Warren was clearly the more explosive back. He's been a better pass catcher. And I think those fears are starting to manifest. Harris held a slight edge in snaps in week 1, 33-25 over Warren. And he had a slight edge in total opportunities, but only 9-8. Plus, Warren's opportunities were more concentrated in targets, whereas Harris was in carries. And in general, targets are more valuable than carries. It looks like this backfield is going to be much closer to a 50-50 split as the season progresses. The last game of the morning session was a brutal affair with the Bengals. Just quite frankly, they crapped the bed on the road at the Browns. I mean, Joe Burrow was horrendous. There's no other way to describe it. He had 45% completion for 82 yards passing. He had no touchdowns. I don't think there's actually anything to take away from this game. I think you just continue to start Burrow and Chase and Higgins and Mixon in week 2. Now, what's crazy is T. Higgins' stat line was one of the strangest things I think I've ever seen. If I told you Higgins got 8 targets and was 4th in the league in air yards with 150 air yards, I think we would say Higgins probably had a pretty good game. Instead, he went 0 for 8. No receptions, no points. Look, better days are ahead for Cincinnati. It was just a crap day, and continue to start your studs in week 2. Now, as for the Browns, Nick Chubb only played 49% of snaps in week 1. Now, what's interesting is that Cleveland ran way more snaps in week 1. They ran 74 snaps than what they typically did last year. When Watson was the starter, they ran 61 snaps on average. But even with a lower snap share, Chubb's opportunities were similar to the previous season. Chubb had 22 opportunities in week 1, including he caught all 4 targets that he got. The last 2 years, Chubb averaged about 20 opportunities a game. So there shouldn't be any concern about Chubb's snap share, because what we saw with the Browns, snaps can be a positive sum variable and not a zero-sum variable. Before we get to the afternoon games, make sure to go follow us on Twitter. It's at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it's at FFAlchemistPod. We'll have more content and data visualizations discussed from the podcast posted on our account. Now, on to the afternoon games. So for the afternoon games, let's first discuss the Packers dominating the Bears on the road. Now, Jordan Love, he finished the week as quarterback 3 with 23 points. And I'll be honest, I'm still a little concerned. In the 2 games last year where Jordan Love got significant playing time, he had a completion percentage of 56% and 59% respectively. In week 1, as the full-time starter, he again had a poor completion percentage of 56%. And the long-term viability of quarterbacks with low completion percentages is very poor. In fact, over the last 2 seasons, the only quarterback who had a completion percentage below 56% was Zach Wilson. And he did it in each of the last 2 years. And even as you increase the completion percentage upward closer to 60%, the quarterback comps don't get much better. You get comps such as Jameis Winston and Sam Darnold. Now, I admit, Love needs more time, but he needs to be more accurate if he's going to retain a starting job beyond this season. And let me quickly mention rookie tight end Luke Musgrave. Musgrave led the team in snaps played and routes run. He had 4 targets, which led the league and he actually led the league in air yards with those 4 targets. Musgrave continues to be one of my favorite breakout candidates at the tight end position. As for the Bears, I won't say it's a disaster after week 1, but from a fantasy standpoint, it isn't good. I said coming into the year, I was worried about this team being a low-volume pass offense with a highly fragmented target share. Now, Justin Fields saw a sharp increase in his pass attempts in week 1 compared to last year. Now, part of that could have been the game script because they fell behind, but of his 37 passing attempts, almost 2/3 of those targets went to the running back group. And DJ Moore only got 2 targets. He was tied for 7th on the team in targets. Moore was one of my largest fades in both redraft and dynasty this summer, and unfortunately, I think you're just going to have to hold Moore on your bench for the next few weeks. Another team that won a divisional game on the road was the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, I was worried about Josh Jacobs coming into camp late. He was playing on a 1-year franchise tag, and I was worried we would see a significant drop in his snap participation and his carry percentage, but that wasn't the case in week 1. You see, Jacobs had the largest snap percentage of any running back in the league last year, above 80%. And he was right at 80% again in week 1. And Jacobs' opportunities from week 1 were on par with his weekly averages from last year. So why did he finish outside the top 30 this week? Well, he was unlucky in the red zone. He had 5 carries in the red zone, but he had no touchdowns. And what was concerning is his yards per carry. You see, last year, Jacobs was at 4.9 yards per carry. On Sunday, Jacobs was at 2.5. Now, effectively, he's getting the same usage, but his yards per carry is about half of what it was last year. If that holds, we're talking about a decrease of about 4 to 5 points a game from last year just on his rushing yards. As for Denver, I continue to be amazed at Javonte Williams and his recovery. I was worried all summer Williams would be a bust in redraft due to limited playing time coming off a serious knee injury, but not only was he back in week 1, but he got a majority of the running back opportunities. He got 13 carries and 5 targets, and Williams averaged 4 yards a carry. He only did it on a 45% snap participation, but I think that climbs as the season progresses, and his efficiency with those opportunities will lead to better weeks more than the running back 29 finish that he had in week 1. Now, my favorite game of the day from an entertainment standpoint was Miami at the LA Chargers. Now, for Miami, just continue to start Tua and Waddle and continue to start Raheem Mostert as long as rookie Devon Achane is out. Mostert had almost 75% snap participation, and he had 11 opportunities in one of the most explosive offenses in the league. As for the Chargers, they ran 80 snaps in week 1, tied for the most in the league. Last year, they averaged about 66 snaps a game. So in general, this is just an offense you want high exposure to. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams should continue to be in your starting lineups. Joshua Kelly should be a waiver wire pickup if he's available. And look, sometimes fantasy football can be as simple as just targeting really good offenses that put up a lot of yards and points. And that's what the case is here with the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, Philadelphia at New England, that was actually a much closer game than I expected. But for Philly, the takeaway is Kenny Gainwell is the primary back in this offense. Rashad Penny was a healthy scratch, and DeAndre Swift, he looked like a non-factor on 29% snap participation. He had 1 carry and 2 targets. Gainwell ran the ball 14 times for 54 yards. He caught 4 passes for 20 yards, and Gainwell got the red zone work. Beat writers this summer said that they thought Gainwell was going to be the running back 1, and that's what turned out to happen in week 1. Now, Gainwell should not only be rostered, he's actually available in more than 50% of leagues ahead of week 2 waiver wire, but he should be actually in your flex consideration going into week 2. As for New England, I've said all summer that Mac Jones was the best value in Dynasty Superflex leagues because, quite frankly, he's just so cheap and he has a strong likelihood of holding his job beyond this year. And I didn't put much stock into last year's performance due to the offensive coaching staff around him, and now you have a professional offensive coordinator in Bill O'Brien. And look, Mac Jones, he looked the part of a solid quarterback too in week 1, and I think that'll be the case going forward. New England was tied with the Chargers with 80 snaps run in week 1. The Patriots averaged 60 snaps run with Mac as the starter last year, and the Pats were pass heavy with 54 pass attempts of the 80 snaps. The Pats far and away had the most pass attempts in the league in week 1, leading to over 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns for Mac Jones. I think the window for acquiring Mac Jones cheaply in Dynasty is about to close, so I would act soon if you need a second quarterback. Now, on to the last game of the afternoon starts. For the Rams, we thought it would come down to Cooper Kupp and Cam Akers, but after week 1, it's already Puka Nacua and Kyren Williams. So first, let's talk about the running backs because Cam Akers he was just terrible. He was awful in week 1. He had 22 carries for 29 yards, 0 targets. He had 1.3 rushing yards per carry. Now, last season across the entire league, there were 113 instances where a running back got at least 20 carries in a game. The lowest yards per carry of all 113 instances was 1.9. Akers was at 1.3 in week 1. It's just horrifically bad. And while Akers was terrible, Kyren Williams was serviceable, which is why he had a 2-to-1 snap share over Akers. He ran almost 30 routes yesterday, and he had 8 opportunities, which is carries plus targets. He had 8 opportunities in the red zone compared to only 2 for Akers. Kyren Williams would then convert those opportunities into 2 touchdowns, and he finished as a top 10 back on the week. And then Rams rookie wide receiver Puka Nacua, he was tied for first in the league with 15 targets in week 1. And he got a target on over 40% of the routes he ran. Last year, there were only 18 instances from 13 unique wide receivers, because a few of these guys did it more than once, but this would be 18 instances from 13 unique wide receivers who had at least 30 routes in a game and at least a 40% target rate. That group is full of elite performing wide receivers, and almost all of them finished inside the top 30 of fantasy scoring last year. Now, it's hard to immediately project Puka Nacua into the league's elite, but I will say the history of rookies and second-year players who have these sort of breakout games in the first half of the NFL season, they typically have strong outcomes. So if you are in a dynasty league where Puka Nacua is available, he should be a priority ad this week. As for the Seahawks, that was a disappointing week 1 for Geno Smith and the rest of this offense. Geno only had 26 pass attempts. He averaged almost 34 a game last year. If the Seahawks are going to regress back to a run-heavy offense, which historically is what Pete Carroll likes to do, this is really tough news for Metcalf and Lockett and rookie receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, I still love JSN. He got a target share on 26% of his routes run in week 1, but right now, the snap and the route volume in this offense doesn't support starting Lockett or JSN. I think you can continue to start Metcalf because he has touchdown upside, but Metcalf and Walker are the only guys I'm comfortable starting in week 2. As for the bloodbath that was Sunday Night Football, it's kind of hard to take anything away from that game from a fantasy standpoint because you had starters get pulled into the second half on both teams, but let me quickly mention Cowboys' Jake Ferguson is a guy I'm still very high on. He was a guy I was high on in dynasty circles all summer. His stat line read 2 catches for 11 yards in week 1, but he had 6 targets on only 13 routes run. That's a nearly 50% target rate. He led the team in targets. He was involved early with the starters. And all Cowboys wide receivers and tight ends, their production was obviously suppressed because Dallas got up big so early. I'm still confident that Ferguson is a breakout tight end candidate. Now, as for the Giants, Daniel Jones was hard to watch in week 1. He wasn't good, but he also didn't have much support from his offensive line. Jones was under 55% completion rate, and Daniel Jones' completion rate has been quite erratic and has had a wide range of outcomes on a weekly basis over the last 2 years and over his career. And for Daniel Jones, his completion percentage correlates pretty strongly to his fantasy production. When Jones is under 60% completion, he averages only 11.4 fantasy points a game. When he's above 60%, he averages 18 points a game, and when he's above 70%, he averages close to 20 points a game. I think this was just a bad game against an elite defense. I'm not ready to panic on Daniel Jones or Saquon Barkley. And then lastly, the Monday night game where, shockingly, Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles and now is out for the season. This means that Zach Wilson is back as the starter for the Jets. It also means the immediate concern from a fantasy standpoint is wide receiver Garrett Wilson. Now, I believe Wilson is an elite player. I think the metrics back that up. But he has struggled to produce with Zach Wilson as his quarterback. Last year, when Zach Wilson wasn't the starter, Garrett Wilson averaged 7 more fantasy points a game. He averaged 5 more targets. He had 25 more receiving yards. He had a higher target share and a higher target per route run rate than when Zach Wilson was the starter. Unfortunately, those who drafted Wilson to be their wide receiver 1 are now likely looking at wide receiver 2 production for the rest of the season. Now, as for the Bills, I know it didn't translate into production we were hoping for, but James Cook has the clear lead role in this offense. Cook had almost a 60% snap participation. He led the team in carries, and he was actually second in targets with 6 targets. James Cook should be an auto start going forward in one of the league's best offenses. Well, there you have it. Observations from all 32 teams after week 1. Make sure to hit subscribe as I'll drop another episode ahead of week 2. I'm Dustin Chandry signing off from the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.